Every man must decide whether he will walk in the light of creative altruism or the darkness of destructive selfishness. This is the judgment. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? That part we began. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? The quote is, you might have guessed based upon the prayers that are written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And apt person to quote on this weekend, where we remember his legacy and his prophetic voice and his challenge to the Church of Jesus Christ, and of course celebrate his birthday. It's also an appropriate quote for our morning scriptures, because they are to a different degree about servanthood, and this quote, though it never uses the word servant, is a quote about what it means to serve others. In particular, the Old Testament passage focuses very directly on servanthood, for it is one of Isaiah's 4 servant songs, the first of the 4 servant songs. These are 4 passages that describe an unnamed servant of God, one who will do God's will, one who, among other things, will restore to Israel its place among the nations. There are also 4 passages found in Isaiah that Christian scholars see as pointing toward the Messiah, the Anointed One. Jewish scholars go back and forth on whether they see these texts as messianic, but Christian scholars feel pretty clear. In this morning's, the first Isaiah servant song seems even to have been used by the gospel writers as they composed the baptismal story of Jesus, making it clear that the gospel writers at the very least saw in these texts words that described Jesus. Indeed, for 2,000 years, Christians have claimed that these 4 songs are predictions about Jesus, that they're primarily about Jesus, that they point to him and only to him, or at least mostly to him. And in this, I think we, for 2,000 years, have not quite gotten the full point of the text. For starters, it's never a good idea to superimpose Christian thoughts back on the text written before Christ, because that's simply not what the writers were trying to write about. It's better instead to ask, what was Isaiah trying to say? And then ask, how might Isaiah's words also give us insight into Jesus? More importantly for me this morning, I think this text leaves the servant's identity undetermined for a reason. And that is, it wants us to ask, just who is this servant? Because that question, who is this servant, can lead to some surprising answers. I believe that the servant identified in the servant songs of Isaiah is not a person, but is anyone who does the work that the servant is given, the work described throughout the 4 servant songs. That is, especially in this first servant song, anyone who does the work of justice and righteousness and shalom. And despite everything I've just said about what we should not do with these texts, that someone, that anyone, certainly includes Jesus. After all, the very same gospel we read this morning that talks about Jesus' baptism also records Jesus doing servant work of justice. Jesus heals all in need, giving free health care to the sick of Galilee and Judea. He feeds the hungry and the thirsty and teaches about the ways of God. In just a few chapters in Matthew, Jesus will talk about turning the other cheek, about being slow to anger and quick to forgive. Jesus will teach about being the light of the world, a phrase he uses in Matthew's gospel for his followers, and not primarily for himself. And perhaps most memorably in Matthew's gospel, Jesus will call upon his followers to care for the least of these, even going so far that It is how we do it, that caring and nothing else, that determines our status in eternity. So really it's no surprise that Matthew connects Jesus to the servant song, because Matthew knew who Jesus was and what he was about. And he knew that the servant song, as in Isaiah, talks about the same thing. The servant song in Isaiah is described as one who will bring forth justice, but do so gently. One who will bring forth justice, understanding that non-violence is the best way to accomplish it. That the ends do not justify the means when it comes to justice, but instead that the means must reflect the end toward which we are working. The servant is the one who will make a covenant with all people throughout all of creation, and will bring God's justice to that same creation. The one who will give sight to the blind, set the prisoners free, and rescue those who sit in darkness. That's how the servant is described in Isaiah. And I ask you, friends, does that also sound like Jesus? Is it any wonder that Matthew read this text and said, that's Jesus, he does this. I'm going to borrow language to understand the Jesus event. Jesus is definitely the servant described in Isaiah. But he's not the only one. There have been many servants in the 2,000 years since Jesus. And one of them we celebrate this weekend. In conversations about Dr. King, I don't think I've ever hid my admiration for who he was and what he stands for, and how much I'm still challenged by his words. I read a couple of sermons of his every MLK weekend, the week of, to remind myself of his prophetic work. Because I believe him to be a prophet in the same vein as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and yes, even Jesus. He falls in that tradition. And like those prophets, his words can inspire us, but can sometimes leave us uncomfortable as we realize the truth behind his critiques and just how far we still have to go to reach God's vision of justice for our country. No one today questions the power and importance of the work of Dr. King as part of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. His methods of nonviolent protest that were very much in the tradition and ways of Jesus are credited with being one of the most powerful tools deployed in that era. And indeed, they're tools that reflect the servant song, reflect the one who will not bruise a wick, the one who takes care that the means and the ends match up. That matches up with Isaiah. Oh, good. King sought to pursue justice by being just, without causing undue harm to others, much like the servant described in the servant song. Although it should be noted, not without disruption. King also gave us quotes that speak to the character that God envisions for us. Quotes such as this: I had decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Or this one: we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. Or even this: darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Yes, Dr. King, in the tradition of Isaiah and Jeremiah, gave us speeches and words that inspire us to the best of ourselves, that teach us how to love one another. But much like those prophets, Dr. King also knew how to speak truth to power. And friends, the power many times was us. Comfortable, somewhat progressive, white, church-going folk who need to be reminded that we have parts to play as well. After all, King also said this: "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." And this: "In the end, we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And indeed, Dr. King's classic book, Letters from Birmingham Jail, was written in the style of Paul to white mainstream congregations just like ours and their pastors, who were calling on King to slow down, to stop ruffling so many feathers, to keep in mind the feelings of those he was opposing, and to work for justice just a little more slowly. Advice King rejected, because King knew that that's not true justice. King knew that those who were in power needed to feel uncomfortable. King knew that those who were like us had parts to play in the work for justice, and that part wasn't sitting quietly in worship. I bring all this up for two reasons. One, because it never hurts to be reminded of the critique that King gives us. Because all of us, your pastor included, sometimes give more priority to our comfort than the work of justice. But I also want us to know that this servant stuff is hard. When done right, fulfilling the call of being a servant, like Isaiah describes, can be beautiful and powerful and world-changing, but it can make others and even ourselves uncomfortable as well. And we have to be ready for that, because we too are called to be servants, just like Isaiah describes. The identity of the servant is one that we too must pick up and carry. We need to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, our brother, and all the prophets who came before us, and cry out for justice in our city, in our country, and our world. We need to seek out thoroughly, without rest, the ways of God, the ways that care for the least of these, the vulnerable, the voiceless, the oppressed. We need to raise our voices, to use our power and privilege, because we are the servants needed for this day and age. We are the ones tasked to work for justice and righteousness and shalom. We are the ones of whom Isaiah was speaking today. And there can be no better time than this weekend to claim this call and begin to live it out. So I invite you this week to be the servant of Isaiah's song, and take some concrete act toward justice. Donate some time or treasure to a nonprofit who you feel is caring for the least of these and speaking out for the voiceless. Call and write Representative Steve King and Senators Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley about an issue you feel is important, about an issue that pertains to justice, and encourage them to work for the ways of God's justice. Pray, as he is inaugurated this week, for our President-elect, and heck, write him too. Pray that he would seek the ways of justice, righteousness, and shalom, and lead our country in the ways of God, and not just in the ways that lead to better profits and more growth. Do these. Do something else, but do something concrete and real as we commit ourselves and fulfill our call to be the servants of justice that God wants us to be. For just who is the servant that Isaiah is speaking of? By the grace of God, it is all of us. For it is God's mission that Isaiah describes, and through our baptism, we are called to be a part of that mission. Dr. King said, and the quote I began with, that one of life's most persistent questions is, what are you doing for others? Isaiah's text calls us to be servants working for justice for others, because we Thanks be to God for the challenge and for the gift. Amen. I invite